I came home for Thanksgiving, and the house was quiet in a way that felt wrong, like a song missing its chorus. My key turned the deadbolt with a light clack. The hallway lamp threw a pool of yellow across the runner rug, and the smell that greeted me was the honest plainness of an empty house. Lemon-scented cleaner, a hint of coffee gone cold, no welcome, no suitcase left by the door, no laughter catching on the banister. The only thing that seemed alive was the old rocking chair in the living room, moving back and forth as if someone had just stood up. A scrap of paper lay on the kitchen counter, folded in a way that felt deliberate. I unfolded it with the small, irritated smile of someone who'd been convinced this would be a weekend of mashed potatoes and matching sweaters. The note didn't say, "Be back soon." It didn't say, "Happy Thanksgiving." It said in Brady's tidy hand that they, Brady, his mother Elaine, and a handful of people whose faces I knew only from holiday dinners, were gone. They were gone to the Caribbean. They were gone with my money. I read it twice, then 3 times, like checking the receipt on a shopping app that is refusing to load. The small print of betrayal rarely looks like romance. It looks like logistics. A promise becomes a line item. The house felt colder. I should have left. I had been trained, in the way you learn any awkward social dance, to pack a bag when something breaks, give it space, give myself time. But the chair kept rocking, and when I crossed into the living room, there was a man in it. Not the man who had written the note. A man I had seen before at holidays, the kind of face you collect in memory like coins. Brady's stepfather, Victor, sat with a blanket over his knees, a precise, unembarrassed sort of dignity about him. He was smaller than I remembered, the angles of his face sharpened in a way that made it hard to recognize him as any sort of version of invulnerable. He looked up at me, and with a little smile that could have been either a question or a welcome, asked, "Shall we get started?" I had rehearsed 1,000 possible openings for what I would say when Brady walked in with a suitcase and a slightly guilty grin. None of them included a man in a rocking chair inviting me to begin the long, quiet work of being present in someone else's last months. He was sharp-eyed. His eyes were a faded blue that could still find a person in a crowded room, but the rest of him carried the evidence of months of things postponed. A thinness at his jaw, a bruise of tiredness around his neck, hands that trembled a little when he reached for his tea. There was something efficient about the way he had made the living room ready, as if he'd been expecting me. A wool throw folded on the arm of the couch, a stack of novels on the side table, a single envelope on the mantel with my name on it. I wanted to be angry at the note. Angry at the photograph that showed up on Brady's Instagram 2 hours later. Bright sunlight, glass of champagne, Brady's easy smile next to a woman who wasn't me. The caption was light, everything that daring absence wants to be. Grateful for sunshine and family. The woman tagged a location 10,000 miles away from our kitchen. There was the careless, performative intimacy of it. Brady's wrist leaned close, laughter caught mid-sip. He had spent the money, and he expected applause. Or perhaps he expected nothing at all, because the people who spend other people's savings are rarely shocked by consequences. They arrange their exits the same way they arrange their holidays, without consulting the rest of the table. I was still looking at the photo when Victor cleared his throat. He didn't seem surprised to see my face fall. He had a way of assessing things that wasn't cruel. It was practical. "You saw the post," he said. No accusation, no attempt to cushion. Perhaps he liked truth the way others liked sugar, straight and unapologetically. "Of course I saw the post," I said. My voice was steadier than I felt. "They left a note." "They left," Victor said, and the simple past made it sound like he thought the word was sufficient explanation for a year's worth of absence. "They left for a cruise, packing other people's vacations around their own comfort. It's a talent." I noticed the set of his hands as he said it, the way a thumb smoothed the edge of the blanket. There was a competence about him that felt like a hold in a storm. "You said you'd be here," I told him. It was a childish thing to say, but there are comforts in stating facts aloud. My plan was dinner at my mother's. "You've always been better at planning than Brady. He has good instincts for where to place potatoes. You have good instincts for where to place potatoes." A sound that might have been a laugh escaped me, fractured and thin. His dry humor was both balm and a reminder that we were not allies by design. Victor married into this family, and then, in most people's version of events, been relegated to the background until he wasn't useful anymore. When Brady's father died years earlier, Victor stayed. He handled the banking details, the paper and signatures, the sort of domestic accounting that people assume is invisible until it isn't. "Where's Brady?" I asked. I tried to keep the question small, an opening that would let me step back into ordinary life. He wasn't only a husband who'd left, he was the person who had made the bed expectations in our marriage. You lean on those beds like someone sitting on a veranda, trusting a railing to hold. Victor's gaze hardened a fraction. "With his mother on a boat," he said. "He's celebrating. He's very pleased with himself." That should have been enough to take me away. Instead, I sat down on the couch, the old springs complaining. The house had the neglected stubs of a life lived in tandem. Photographs on the wall, a pressed leaf in the cookbooks, a coffee mug that said #DesignLife on the counter. My brain tried to tally the practicalities, whose laundry, which subscription fees, which pet. There was no pet. And then it slid to the bank app. The bank app will answer truths even when people will not. Brady had his phone left on the counter. Part of me considered leaving it, part of me wanted to smash it to silence. I picked it up because the part of me that used to build mock-ups for living rooms and websites liked to collect data as if patterns could be rearranged into explanations. There were notifications I hadn't expected, travel pins, purchase confirmations, messages from someone named Maya, a name I didn't know but could guess at from the cocky way the notifications winked. When I opened the bank app then, the numbers were a punchline with a dark grin. 3 transfers to a travel agency, multiple withdrawals at high-end restaurants, a charge at a boutique hotel, the balance, our balance. The app rendered arithmetic coldly. Overdraft in one account, a diversion of a line item that had been labeled savings, home improvements, now empty. I felt a slow, boiling clarity that begins as dizziness and sharpens into indignation. Money isn't just numbers, it's the way we say we. It's how you promise a future that looks different than present consumption. I showed him the phone. He took it, I said. The phrase felt inadequate, like saying he took the bread about something that had taken a life. It was a small theft only if you thought about coins. It was a larger kind of theft if you thought about trust. Victor didn't look surprised. He took the phone from me and scrolled with a finger that didn't shake. "He has always been good at moving things out of sight," he said. He thought me gullible. He miscalculated. There was a rhythm to his sentences, short, efficient, a banker's cadence. He'd spent a career being precise with money and with words, and that precision shielded him from the sentimental fog others used as armor. "Have you—" I began, then stopped. There was a practical part of my brain that wanted to call the bank, freeze accounts, shout at people on the phone, and there was another part that wondered if any of that would matter while a parade of Instagram photos existed as public justification. Social media is both mirror and stage. Brady had already performed his innocence to an audience that accepted charm as explanation. Victor's eyes softened, and there was a moment when I saw the man he had been before this family had become an argument. "I have papers," he said. "Not the sort Brady knows how to move, not the sort he can touch without us noticing. I have had plans for some time." There was a pause where plans could have meant anything. Estate plans, the kind you write because you think you're immortal. Stash plans, the kind you tuck under floorboards in hope. The sentence was small, but it reoriented the room like a compass needle settling after a shove. Victor reached for his teacup and set it down carefully, as if the ceremony of tea could make intentions visible. "You're ill," I said. It wasn't a question. He'd been thinner, and kindness comes in the currency of bluntness sometimes. "How long?" He looked at the ceiling, at the neat grid where the day's light tracked across plaster. "Weeks," he said. "Months if I'm fortunate. Pancreatic." He let the word rest like an honest ledger item. "The doctors gave me options and schedules, and I elected to focus on clarity." Clarity. The word had the coolness of someone trimming fat from a will. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. The real question was softer. Why had he not told me sooner? Did he not think of me? Did he not trust me? The honed edge of betrayal often cuts finer than infidelity. It's the absence of inclusion. "He told no one," he said. "Not Brady, not Elaine. Privacy feels like a final courtesy for a man with few other choices, and there are things to be done if one wants them done properly." There was a weight to his voice. For a moment he became the kind of man who kept a ledger of small responsibilities, who took the dog to the vet on Tuesday, whose name was on the insurance. I realized I had been wrong about him being merely pushed to the margins of family life. He had been handling margins, keeping accounts I hadn't seen. He stood and shuffled to a side table, and when he returned he held a manila envelope. "This is why I asked you to come home," he said simply. "I have kept a file." Inside were documents, statements, neat photocopies, a small notebook with angular handwriting. There were entries that read like records of micro-deprivations, checks made out to household expenses that never hit household shelves, fees for services never rendered, notes about phone calls where someone reminded him to sign. It was the slow, methodical language of bureaucracy pointing at violence. Not the screams of a falling body, but the slow theft of agency. A withheld doctor's appointment here, a diverted check there. "Brady has been manipulating things for longer than you've known," Victor said. "He learned how money moves in people's hands. He is practiced at convincing people that their lives will be better if he is unencumbered. He believes charm exempts him." I felt a hot, private anger bloom in my chest. People call this kind of theft financial abuse, but that phrase flattens the human parts. The look you get when someone takes your name off a bank account, the way a spouse learns the currency of silence. It isn't about numbers alone. It's about the way a person takes away the scaffolding you built for your future with the same nonchalance as adjusting a pair of sunglasses. Victor lifted another paper. "I have placed certain assets into trusts," he said, "not out of spite, out of obligation. I did this before I felt like explaining myself to people who found it convenient to forget me." "Trusts?" I repeated, more to buy time than because I didn't understand. I am not dumb. I design financial-facing websites for a living. I understand the difference between a checking account and something designated with legal purpose. But there is a difference between knowing words and believing that the words can act as armor when a person decides to bare their teeth. "Yes," Victor said. "Not all of it is accessible to Brady, not by design. There are names, beneficiaries, and funds that cannot be moved without my consent and proper witnesses. The problem is the practical control Brady has. He has been signing bills, directing payments. He siphoned liquidity and left us with accounts that bounce." You planned this? The question came out thinner than I felt. The kind of planning that leaves the final page of your life blank is strange. People plan for estates like people plan for the weather, some with umbrellas, some with sunscreen. Victor had an umbrella and a map of the high ground. I planned for my life, he said. I did not plan for being abandoned, but I did not want my last decisions to be a free-for-all. He looked at me then, and the look was not the aloofness of a man above his family. It was the look of a man inviting trust. I need someone to see this through, someone who will not be silenced. In that moment, the house felt less like an abandoned stage and more like the center of an argument that had been rearranged without its prop master. The old rocking chair creaked. The mantel clock ticked like a small jury. I had come home expecting mashed potatoes and a plausible script of obligation. Instead, I had been handed evidence and a responsibility I hadn't auditioned for. There is a peculiar shock to having your life recentered on someone else's final months. It forced me to sort myself into categories: the woman who had been wronged by her husband, the designer who could see patterns, the person who could either walk away or become someone who stayed. I thought of my mother, who had a way of solving problems by leaving. I thought of Brady's confident smile in the Instagram photo. The world had a way of being ordered around people who left without conversation. Why me? I asked. It was partly rhetorical. It was also a way to ask whether he had considered the ethics of what he was proposing, because ethics are not extemporaneous. They are the scaffolding on which decisions rest. He smiled in a way that lacked pretense. Because you came back. There is a humility in that reason, in the bluntness of it. Returning is often the most decisive thing people do. It signals attention. It signals a willingness to occupy space. The grocery list of morality sometimes begins with small actions like turning a key, walking through a door, and sitting. The first hours after that unraveled with a strange pace. I texted Brady and got no reply. I called him and reached voicemail. I texted Elaine and got a short, clipped reply. Needed a break. Victor is fine. It was the kind of minimization that families use when they wish to avoid being seen. I made a pot of tea and we sat and read the files. Victor had lined things out in a pragmatic chronology. There were photocopies of statements that showed odd withdrawals, entries about monthly fees that had been rerouted, invoices marked paid that weren't. There were notes describing times when Brady had persuaded Victor to postpone appointments or had made arrangements that meant someone else did the driving. It looked like the kind of slow violence that accumulates until someone counts the missing pages. "Did you file these?" I asked, "with anyone?" He said, "I had them, I've not put them in motion. That requires people you'd need to trust more than Brady. I wanted to be certain of my mind." He said the last clause in a way that made me think of the many legal conversations I've read where doctors and lawyers use phrases like competency and lucid with an assumption of finality. Victor had been through them. He had seen physicians and had, on his own terms, decided he had the mental clarity to make choices. He was not brittle. He was not fogged. He was precise. "You want me to help," I said, because it was the obvious next sentence. The smaller sentence beneath it was bigger and not yet fully formed. "You want me to care for you in your last months and perhaps help you keep what is rightly yours away from people who have treated you as convenient." That is not a small ask. It asks someone to be the steward of the end of another's life, a role that combines mundane chores, ordering groceries, refilling library books, with moral labor. "Yes," he said. It was not a dramatic plea. It was a request sharpened by the knowledge of time. "I cannot do this properly alone, and I cannot trust those who would pocket what is not theirs." There is a moral blur when someone you once regarded as family decides to take advantage of another. Betrayal is sometimes an art practiced by the intimate. It moves in kitchens and over dinner tables, collecting trivialities until they feel like fate. I made coffee. I brewed it with an attention that felt like prayer. Then I cooked something dumb and ordinary, peaches with cream, because there was a small ritual Victor liked, and I remembered that taste from a holiday years back. When I set the dish down beside the rocking chair, he smiled as if he'd been waiting for it. "You always make the best peaches," he said. It was a sentence that belonged in a different life, the kind where people forgive each other for small omissions and go on. We ate in the quiet room and talked like two people assembling a map. He told me about the trusts, about how certain assets were already designated for charities that supported elder dignity, the sort of thing that made him lighter than the fight. He was not interested in spite. He wanted stewardship. He wanted to make certain that the money he had left would be used in ways that aligned with his life, rather than diverted into a lifestyle he had never approved of. "You will need help," he said at one point. "Do you have anyone who can be your witness, someone who knows the truth without being," he searched for a word, "compromised?" I thought of neighbors I barely knew. There was Melissa down the street, a retired teacher who kept perfect hydrangeas and looked at the world like it was a complicated novel worth reading carefully. There was Mr. Collins from the next block, who had once lent me his ladder. There was a small web of people who did not belong to Brady's ring of convenience. They were not close, but they were available in a way that might matter. "You have to be sure," he said. "Trust needs witnesses, not because I enjoy the paperwork, because people will believe the written trace." He was being careful with the language of institutional legitimacy, wills, trusts, notaries. He was not asking for drama. He was asking for a steady hand to help shore up what he had built. In the days that followed, the neighbors became less like background scenery and more like a mutual aid network. Melissa brought soup, the kind that tastes like someone has visited a childhood you never knew. Mr. Collins offered to sit and tell stories about the neighborhood. Small acts of kindness do an odd thing. They stitch you to a world that otherwise wants to let you fall through its cracks. It was in those small gestures that I felt the tension between my urge for private hurt and the ethical clarity of public care. Victor, to his credit, never pushed me toward dramatic plans. He favored the slow gathering of facts, of presence. He insisted on an attorney, and I called the number he wrote down. Patricia arrived the next day, not with some indulgent theatricality, but with a clipped competence, a woman in sensible shoes who read documents like a person reading a recipe she'd made 1,000 times. She asked questions that made sense, dates, thereabouts of diagnosis, names to put on paper. She listened to Victor and nodded, and there was a gravity to the way she took notes. "I'll need documentation of your diagnosis," she said matter-of-factly, "a physician's statement, competency assessments, witnesses for any signatures." Her language was careful. When lawyers speak tactfully, they are doing what professions do. They make a path across a field of thorny possibilities so people can walk it without tearing their clothes on ethics. I felt the moral gears shift as Patricia spoke. There was no inclination toward cheap victory. Everything she said required order, witnesses, legal propriety. If we were going to change anything, it would be done with eyes open. Victor insisted on that. He wanted dignity in his end, not a melodramatic takedown with popcorn. And yet, there was an ethical kink I couldn't smooth, the staging. Victor, in a moment of clarity and mischief, mentioned that he had considered making certain things visible in a way that would make it hard for anyone to ignore. Quote, "People believe the visible," he said. "A photograph matters more than an argument." I bristled at the idea of deception. I had spent my career making designs that didn't lie, interfaces that made clear where the click would lead. The notion of manufacturing evidence to shame people was distasteful. It drifted dangerously close to the kind of trap that turns someone into the thing they despise. Victor seemed to expect my recoil. "This isn't about lying," he said quickly, as if to forestall the moral uproar. "This is about making the truth impossible to ignore. It's about showing what has been done in a form that people cannot simply ignore with a text message." Patricia raised an eyebrow. "We must be careful," she said. "Anything that looks like fabrication will be challenged. There are ethical lines we cannot cross. But there are legitimate ways to document neglect and exploitation. Affidavits, bank statements, video testimony under oath. We proceed with fact, not theater. There is relief in a professional's limits. They keep you honest. They make sure that when you act under a roof of rules." Victor seemed relieved, too. "I want this to be clean," he said. "I want them to see what they have done and for that seeing to have consequence. But I also want it to be honest." We sat with that for a while, the three of us in the living room where the chair continued its patient sway. Outside, November light had become thin, and through the window I could see the neighbor's porch light flick on. The domestic world marched on, indifferent. Inside, a conspiracy of care was forming. It was not violent, it was patient. It was not revenge as spectacle, but revenge as correction. The legal language knitted itself around the personal hurt, and the personal hurt softened into a steady, resolute task. For my part, I went through stages of feeling. Rage had been the first, hot, sharp, ready to cut. Then came a kind of bewildered shame. How long had I been companion to a lie? And then, surprisingly, a stern little flame of resolve. There are forms of dignity you reclaim by the small acts of doing. I started making calendars of appointments, of calls, of people to contact. I plotted simple things, doctor appointments for Victor, time to record him if you wanted to speak, witnesses who would watch him sign documents that reflected his wishes. The work was oddly sanctifying. You can't be undone if you are conscientious. At night, when the house was empty of other people's absences, Victor would ask for stories. He liked small concessions, the ones you save for people you trust. I told him about work, about clients who demanded impossible timelines, and how I taught them to keep their promises. He told me about a bank he had helped run in his youth, about the ritual of opening a drawer and finding a ledger that belonged to families he had never known. He said that at the end of one's life, the most useful thing you can give someone is your attention. He consented to the plan in its broad strokes with a clarity that felt like a vow. He wanted his affairs to be in order, his wishes respected, and his final months spent in real human company rather than the staged concern of people who left him unattended for the sake of a vacation. He did not gloat. He did not want them to suffer so much as he wanted them to be confronted with the reality of what their absence had produced. Confrontation is an invitation, he told me once, not a curse. There were small interpersonal tests. Brady's mother, Elaine, called once and asked where Victor was. Her voice was the voice of someone calling from the other side of a court hearing, formal, slightly sheeted. When I told her he was at home and that I'd like to see her, she demurred and said they were caught up in travel. There was a politeness to her distance that was practiced and effective. It was the avoidance of detail, the use of voices that smooth over harm. When neighbor Melissa brought over one of her lemon pies, she lingered. "You look like you've been through an avalanche," she said, with that disarming frankness of teachers who have seen everything and learned to be direct. "Do you need me to be a witness to anything? I have a notary stamp in my desk drawer if it comes to that, and I'll come with you to any appointment." I wanted to keep her kindness like a hot water bottle, comforting, immediate. The community's small readiness to offer practical help felt like an answer to the loneliness of being wronged. It wasn't dramatic, it was factual. People who know you can, sometimes, be the saving proof that you are not alone. Days folded into a routine of sorts. I ran between appointments, sat with Victor while he took short naps that he called charging, made lists, called Patricia, and watched the Instagram feed of a family on a beach. In the quiet hours when I sorted bank statements and names, I felt the kind of focus that makes you dangerous in a good way. It's the focus of someone who has been roughed up by randomness and decides to file it alphabetically. One night, after a thin Thanksgiving meal that we ate alone because the house felt too hollow to host company, Victor asked me to read aloud the letter he had written. He had recorded it, he said, because he wanted his words to be his own, clear, steady, addressed to people who had taken for granted that a man could be invisible until death. He wanted to tell them plainly what had happened, and he wanted the telling to be in his voice. His voice in the recording was both tender and unflinching. He spoke about being overlooked, about the small daily losses that add up until a man can't find his place at the table. He mentioned that he had taken steps to ensure his estate would not be handled by people who had used proximity as a way to take what wasn't theirs. He named names without malice. He asked for dignity, for the truth to be respected. When we listened to it together, I could hear a man deciding to be clear at the end. It wasn't vindictive, it wasn't spectacle. It was a will composed by someone who had seen both the arithmetic and the human cost. I thought of Brady smiling on a cruise, unaware that the man he had left behind was composing a record that would be hard to unread. I was making notes at the end of that day when the phone buzzed. The number was unknown, clipped. Patricia's voice was steady when she spoke. "We can move forward," she said, "but we must be sure we do this right. We cannot manufacture evidence. We can, however, document the truth. I'll come by tomorrow with forms. Bring any bank statements and the physician's notes you have. We'll draft amendments and make sure witnesses are available." Everything clicked into that profession's cadence. Paper, witnesses, signatures. It was the kind of plan that sounds ordinary when spoken aloud, but requires an enormous moral weight to pull off in the face of family indifference. I felt the old fury coalesce and settle into purpose. Before Patricia hung up, she added, almost as if she were checking a personal note, "And Zara from the bank has offered to review the account history with us. She may be able to flag some of these transfers as unauthorized. Be cautious with any aggressive moves. The family will likely react strongly when they return." The sentence had a briskness to it that left room for no melodrama. The bank would help. The lawyer would be present. Witnesses were offering their names. It was, in its own way, the slow arming of a moral engine. I stood in the kitchen holding the phone, thinking about the Instagram photo again. There is a cruelty to how brightly people can fet themselves while leaving others to pick up the pieces. I thought about Brady to come home, to face what he'd done. I thought about the ring on my dresser, the small metal circle that still felt warm sometimes in its memory of earlier days. I thought about returning it. The impulse was swift and final. The next morning I walked to the mantel and found the envelope with my name. Inside was a small hand-folded note from Victor. "If you want, return the ring. Your future shouldn't be tied to his looseness. I won't judge you for leaving a marriage that was already gone." The ring sat heavy in my palm that afternoon as I walked to the mailbox to drop it in an envelope. There is a ritual in returning someone's promise. It is an unsexy, resolute act. It is a way of saying that you will not let your life orbit someone else's charm. On the short walk back, Melissa came up behind me with a take-out cup of coffee and a concerned look. "How are you?" she asked, as if the question wasn't rhetorical. "I'm paying attention," I said, and that felt like the sincerest answer. It was not enough to be outraged. Outrage would have been a flash. This would require patience, persistence, and the mild cruelty of keeping an appointment. It would also require tenderness in the at-home moments. Peaches, a book read aloud, the quiet ritual of helping someone shave when his hand tremors. Caregiving has an economy of its own. Its currency is not heroics, but steadiness. Victor surprised me with his moments of levity. Once, while I read aloud a passage from a novel about a woman who collects stamps, he laughed and said, "I once enamored a board by referring to a spreadsheet as art." They were not amused. His humor was often a small weapon against the absurdity of having to arrange one's exit while people who were supposed to be family paraded in pictures. When I look back on those first days, I remember the gradual reorientation of what I thought my life would be. I had imagined the weekend of Thanksgiving as a familiar comfort. Instead, it became an unplanned apprenticeship in caring for someone else's end. It was humiliating in the way betrayal always is. It was also clarifying, like a photograph developed in a darkroom. The absence of the people who should have been here made room for the presence of people who would come. Neighbors, an attorney with a quiet manner, a hospice nurse named Diane who spoke of dignity as if it were a simple table to set. There were nights when the house felt too big and other nights when it felt right-sized for the work. Victor slept poorly sometimes, and I would sit in the kitchen with a cup of tea and spreadsheets so redolent of betrayal that they might have been medieval accusation scrolls. I arranged for Patricia to visit with forms, for Melissa to be on standby as a witness, for a bank meeting to be set for the following week. We moved with a slow, precise momentum: order, witness, legality. I did not know how much we were allowed to plan. There was a hum in the background of the family knowing nothing, a hum that made the whole situation thick with potential. Brady would return from the cruise. We could envision each step: the photographs of bright beaches, their soft returns, the silence of a house that had become charged with the weight of being overlooked. But for now, the planning had a more immediate need: to document, to care, to construct an argument that would not taste like revenge because it would be built of facts. There were moral doubts that visited me at odd hours. In the quiet of 2 a.m., when Victor's breathing shifted and the house settled into the kind of stillness that lets every thought stand up, I would ask myself whether we were becoming the very thing the men in our lives had been. We were gathered together in part because others had chosen to remove themselves. We were constructing a narrative that would be difficult to ignore. Was that manipulation, or was it a last recourse, the kind you use when more straightforward measures are inaccessible? Victor refused to let me luxuriate too long in self-flagellation. "Do not confuse rectitude with cruelty," he said once, when my moral anxieties ran away with me. "There is a time to be patient and a time to stop being polite about injustice." We were not, I understood, planning to make people suffer for the sake of spectacle. We were planning to make them see, in ways that could not be waved off as women's hysteria or old man grumbling, the trail they had left. Patricia's presence ensured that the plan would be legible to institutions. Melissa's attendance ensured that someone with an ordinary life would testify that they had seen care deferred. The bank manager's involvement ensured that finances could be read like a ledger of behavior. At some point in the shift between days, I realized how much responsibility had consolidated around me. I had not asked for guardianship of the end of someone's life, but when someone you respect asks you to help them secure dignity, you respond. It is a moral physics that rearranges your center of mass. You move differently. Brady's Instagram continued to update, decisive, bright, unapologetic. Friends liked his photos. The world continued to confer normalcy on someone who had left a man to his own devices while pocketing a future. Social media has a way of refusing calamity the dignity of full attention. It prefers the curated moment. It prefers the ocean and the clinking glasses. There was a single moment, days later, when the equilibrium tilted. I had driven to the bank with a cardboard file under my arm. Inside it were statements Victor had photocopied and my notes. The bank manager, Zara, greeted us like a person who had practiced calm. "We cannot give access retroactively," she said, her voice efficient, "but we can flag transfers and begin an audit. There is a process to follow." "It will be messy," Patricia said, pen poised. "There will be pushback. We prepare to be challenged." Victor, who had sat with surprising equanimity, met my eyes. "I'm ready," he said. The words settled. It was less dramatic than it might sound on the page. It meant he had the emotional bandwidth to face his end with clarity. It meant he preferred truth to the charade of abandonment. He wanted the record to show what had been done to him so that the harms had a chance of being remedied, or at least acknowledged. I left the bank with the kind of exhaustion that follows minor triumphs. We were assembling the facts, aligning witnesses, and making plans for formal documentation. It felt like a slow, meticulous siege. Within the siege, there were ordinary tendernesses: a neighbor who brought soup, a nurse named Diane who visited and explained hospice in terms that were humane rather than clinical, a quiet moment where Victor and I watched an old film and laughed at the same bits. Dignity, I learned, lives in those small, sustained acts. There was still a gaping absence at the heart of the matter: Brady. There were nights I imagined him stepping through the front door with a sunburn and an apologetic grin, and there were nights I imagined his face as a small, complicated thing, asking for absolution or anger or both. I tried to be honest with myself. I had been wronged and I had the right to leave, but there was a man in the rocking chair who had been wronged in a different register, and I could not abandon him because someone else had chosen a vacation over an appointment. When the Thanksgiving weekend became a calendar of appointments and witness lists, I sent a single message to social media, nothing dramatic. The note sat in my phone like a quiet release, but before I could press send, the battering of a small thing arrived that took our plans off the paper and into the room. Victor coughed in the night, a sound like paper torn quietly, and in the morning there was a new reality we had to face, one that would test both our patience and the fragile architecture of our careful plan. It was not a tragedy in the dramatic sense. It was the kind of clinical change that forces decisions into sharp moral focus. I watched Victor for a long time, the way you watch a clockwork device, noting the small shifts in his breath, the way his fingers curled when he fell asleep. The day stretched like a question, and for the first time since I'd come home, I felt the totality of it: the absence of his family, the weight of accounts, and the need to move from being merely a witness to someone else's life into someone who would do the work it takes to keep a man's last choices intact. After Zara at the bank and Patricia in her sensible shoes set the paths, the days condensed into a kind of sacred urgency. Victor's cough sharpened and then receded for a day, like a tide pretending to be merciful. Diane, the hospice nurse, arrived with a calm that felt like a promise. She had soft hands and the habit of saying things plainly. "Comfort is a practical thing," she told me the first afternoon she came, as if naming it made it less fragile. She explained, in the kind of language that keeps people human, what the coming weeks might look like: pain management options, ways to keep Victor comfortable, the idea that dying well is mostly about being seen. Her presence cut through the theatrical impulse I sometimes felt in the quiet house. She made caregiving feel like work that required attention, not drama. There were practicalities we could not avoid. Victor insisted on one small thing that felt like a rebellion against both sentiment and spectacle. He wanted his private rituals kept. He wanted the same mug each morning, the same playlist at dusk, the peaches with cream on the third day. Those small rituals were not performances, they were dignity in miniature. I learned to time the song he liked so it would drift into the room just as he woke, to keep his favorite blanket folded across his knees so he could feel remembered without having to ask for it. And then there was the documentation, the thing that made the plan both moral and durable. Patricia worked with a quiet thoroughness I admired. She made lists and made them sensible. Thomas, the notary down the street, agreed to be on call. Zara arranged for an account review and put holds where she could while the audit began. Melissa and Mr. Collins agreed to be witnesses. They came to our living room with their small certainties and very ordinary lives, and in doing so they made our legal theater plain and hard to dispute. We had a conversation about the visuals. Victor said plainly, "People don't believe claims without a photograph. They'll say it's your word against theirs." He did not say it in spite or cruelty. He said it in the measured voice of a man who had spent a life learning how institutions read truth. Patricia tightened her mouth in thought and said, "We proceed with the truth. We document. We don't fabricate." The sentence read like a rubric. Document, do not invent. James, a practical acquaintance who supplied medical props to hospice centers, knocked on the door with the awkwardness of someone who feels like a courier for conscience. He slipped past the line between necessity and theater without ever pushing it. A few clean bandages, a wheelchair that folded and unfolded like polite machinery, a simple portable stand that made an empty corner look like a monitoring station. I stared at the items like a slow-motion consumer choosing between tools. They were props in the sense that they made certain truths visible: an empty pill box photographed on a counter, a ledger beside an unpaid bill. But they were not instruments of deception. Everything we produced had a basis: physician notes, bank statements, neighbor observations. James's boxes simply made it possible for the house to show what had been unseen. There were moments when my own conscience was the loudest critic in the room. I would stand in the doorway and imagine Brady returning, breath salted by the ocean, ready to find a man who had been left alone and a wife who had staged his sorrow for effect. I would think of how easy it is to slip from righteous protection into performance. Victor saw me wrestle with this and said with an almost playful bluntness, "If you need me to be theatrical for them to be honest, then perhaps a small performance is a mercy." He said it as if it were a modest proposal, not vengeance. There was a sadness in that suggestion, an admission that some people only pay attention when their vanity is jarred. We recorded things the way professionals do, under oath, with witnesses present, with doctor's notes appended. Victor sat in the rocking chair, steady and crisp, and spoke into a camera Patricia brought, a decent camera, operated by someone who knew not to lionize or dramatize. He spoke about the small violences, missed appointments, diverted checks, conversations where he had been persuaded that his fears were excess. He named the pattern with a cool specificity that left no room for romanticizing the harm. In the video, he was not a man seeking revenge. He was a man making a ledger of his life and asking that his end be handled according to the rules he'd trusted for years. He signed amendments with Thomas at the kitchen table, with Melissa and Mr. Collins as witnesses, and with Diane there to confirm that his competence had been assessed and found intact by the physician who had seen him last week. Patricia's professional voice threaded credibility into every signature. The mechanics of it were intentional but not cunning. It was legal work conducted with care. There were nights when the house felt like a courtroom in waiting. I would sit with my laptop open at the dining table and arrange photocopies, while Victor slept with his hands curled like an old photograph. He liked to startle me with an anecdote about the bank he had once run, how small deceptions erode reputations the way water erodes stone. A man can be worn down by years of being told he misunderstands, he said one evening, and I could hear the quiet exhaustion under his humor. It was a phrase that explained everything we were doing, not theatrical takedown, but the slow unmasking of a habit of taking. The neighbors' testimonies were small and stubbornly human. Melissa wrote an affidavit about the days she had driven Victor to the grocer and how Brady had complained about the time it took. Mr. Collins described the time he saw a courier collect a check and heard nothing about it later. Zara at the bank produced a paper trail of transfers that lacked the usual signatures and explanations. All of it was built from plain things, dates, names, receipts, the sort of minutia that becomes devastating when collected into a pattern. Not everyone in the house was calm. Sometimes Elaine would call, and her voice would skirt responsibility with practiced ease. "We thought he'd be fine," she'd say, the phrase wearing the armor of a person who has rehearsed denial into an art. Brady's messages arrived sporadically initially, an emoji here, a question about our cat's feed schedule, then grew thicker with denials. At one point, he sent a text that read like a public relations brief more than an apology. "This is all being blown out of proportion. Mom and I have been doing what's best for everyone." He had the knack of flattening moral questions into administrative ones. I read his messages aloud to Victor once, and he made an irritated sound. "When charm becomes a defense, people forget consequence," he said. Time, which had been our enemy, became an ally in a peculiar way. Each document we filed, each witness who signed, each recorded statement hardened the truth. Patricia moved with the economy of someone who knew the law's rhythms and its limits. She didn't promise convictions, only the most robust form of evidence we could compile. There is a certain comfort in realism. It steadied me when moral doubt made my hands tremble. One night, as rain wrapped the house in a gray hush, Victor asked for the camera again. He said, "I want to be direct." He sat up carefully, and his voice was small and precise. "If they come back and expect theatrics, let them see instead the arithmetic of their absence. Let them hear what it sounded like when someone decided to keep an account of their behavior." He directed us to address the statements not as accusations, but as records. "Make no claims you cannot substantiate," he said, "but do not let them rewrite me into a footnote in their convenience." He signed a short letter that evening, the handwriting slow and firm. It addressed Brady and Elaine by name. He wrote calmly that he valued dignity and that he had redirected certain assets to protect care and to benefit charities that supported elders. He asked that if they harbored hurt, to let the hurt be named. The letter was not triumphant. It was a practical last request couched in quiet sorrow. There were moments of pure tenderness that cut any notion of calculated action to ribbons. One afternoon, when the sunlight slanted through the blinds, my hands trembled a little as I threaded a needle, and he watched like a man receiving a small mercy. He reached out and covered my fingers with his as if to steady me. "Thank you for staying," he said. The sentence was both an accolade and a confession. In those moments, the entire scaffolding of legal strategy felt secondary to the human work we were doing, holding a hand, spooning peaches, reading a paragraph of a silly novel until we both laughed at the same joke. And yet the plan required moments when we had to be steely. Patricia scheduled meetings, Thomas witnessed signatures at the kitchen table, Zara at the bank began formal inquiries. There were forms and stamps and confirmations that translated domestic betrayal into a sequence that institutions could read. When the first formal notice arrived from the bank, an internal flag that triggered an internal audit, I felt an odd sense of relief. The system we had appealed to was answering in its neutral way. It would not be immediate revenge, it would be a bureaucratic cascade, slow and likely messy, but it was a cascade nonetheless. We set a small date for action, a date where certain documents would be signed, certain statements recorded, and where a letter would be mailed to Brady and Elaine informing them of Victor's intentions. Victor, in a burst of private mischief, insisted we wait to send the notice until he had taught me how he liked his tea prepared. He wanted the world to have the ordinary smallness of his habits before it encountered the gravity of his decisions. The day before the scheduled formalities, something shifted in the house. Victor's breathing became shallower. Diane, whom I had come to rely on like a lighthouse, moved through the rooms with the efficient gentleness of someone who had prepared for nights like this. She adjusted blankets, refilled water, and sat in silence when that was called for. Patricia stayed away for a while, respecting the room, but she was at the end of the phone. Melissa came and lent a steady chair to my side. The house held its breath. The night Victor died was not cinematic. There was no moment of melodrama, no sharp collapse. There was a small, precise quiet. I sat in a chair by the window, watching the streetlight wash the curtains in pale gold. Victor's breathing paused, resumed, and then eased. Diane marked the time with a softness I will always associate with her. Victor looked at me as if he were noting an old familiar truth. "You stayed," he said, the phrase thin with relief. "You did the necessary thing." I felt a grief that was immediate and complex, the terrible sadness of losing someone who had offered me a role that changed the course of my life, the muted anger that had been collected like receipts and now lay on the table, a kind of exhausted gratitude for the small domestic rituals we had shared. I held his hand until the warmth faded, and I did not feel triumphant. I felt like someone who had been given the chance to answer a call when others chose to leave. After his death, the practical world spun back into place. Diane arranged for hospice to do the rest. Patricia arrived, gentle and efficient, to handle the legal transitions. Thomas notarized the amendments Victor had signed in the weeks prior. Zara followed up with confirmations that certain assets had been placed under the trusts Victor had specified. It is important to be honest. The bank's actions were administrative, not moral judgments. They moved certain items into places where they could not be easily diverted. They flagged irregular transfers. They began audits. Contestation remained possible. The future could still contain legal fights, but the immediate energy of being able to point to legally witnessed documents and to a man's recorded testimony felt like a shelter against casual erasure. We collected our evidence and put it in clean manila folders. Patricia created a succinct package, a folder for the bank, a folder for certain charities, and a plain envelope for Brady and Elaine with Victor's letter and a copy of his recorded testimony. I wrote down the sequence of actions, dated and notarized, the human equivalents of a ledger. There was no malice in how we arranged it. There was a sober desire for clarity. The letter to the family was sent by certified mail. The recording was kept safe. Patricia told me, with that lawyerly caution, that the family would likely seek to contest some aspects of the transfers and that it was possible they would litigate. "We have done what we can to ensure their options are reduced," she said. "We have evidence, we have witnesses, but the legal system has its own pace and temperament." Her tone was neither optimistic nor bleak. It was accurate. I expected them to return sooner. They came back on a wet morning when the street smelled of rain and cheap perfume. Brady's smile in the photos that day would have been sharper than his Instagram grin, more apologetic, perhaps rehearsed. Elaine's posture projected a deliberate composure. They walked through the front door like people entering a room where they had been invited, not like people coming back to find consequences. Their reaction to Victor's death was as calibrated as the rest of them. They were sorrowful in the way of people who have rehearsed sorrow, a damp look in the eye, a hand on a shoulder. But it faltered when they saw the stack of documents on the kitchen table and the clustering of neighbors in the living room. Patricia greeted them with the unemotional calm of someone who knows the law's capacity to complicate grief. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said. Then she slid a folder across the table and let the paper speak. There was disbelief, an initial wave where they attempted to reduce Victor's last acts to eccentricity. Brady's voice pitched between horror and offense. "This is he began, then stopped as Patricia quietly played the recording Victor had made. He spoke slowly, simply, about the small, incremental betrayals, about missed appointments, about dates that had been rearranged until his life was performed for others' ease. He named behaviors, he named the ways bank balances had been shifted and accounts used as ATM machines for the convenience of family. He did not scream, he did not seek revenge, he simply stated facts. As the recording wound into the room, the faces around the table shifted. Melissa's eyes glistened. Mr. Collins held his chin like someone listening to the verdict. The bank statements lay on the table, annotated with notes and dates. Zara explained where transfers had been flagged and what an audit might reveal. Patricia read a short paragraph about the trust amendments. Certain assets had been designated to charities and to a trust that required multiple signatories before funds could be moved, safeguards Victor had insisted upon. Thomas confirmed the notarizations. It's important, again, to be realistic. Legal documents do not always end disputes. They complicate them. They give the person wronged a better chance to have their claims heard. But there was a moment, brief and brittle, when the family realized these were not theatrics. That realization landed like a concrete block. Brady's face went a color I had seen before when budgets are discussed and wants are denied, a striping of panic and calculation. "Victor, you can't," Elaine said, as if Victor were present and could answer. "This is his wish? He didn't explain." Patricia's tone remained even. Mr. Victor Lewis met with counsel, had assessments confirming competency, and executed amendments with witnesses and a notary. The documents are in order. Brady's plea was less about legality and more about entitlement. He tried charm, then anger, then tears. He asked for clemency not because he had changed, but because his options had narrowed. I listened to him with a calm I did not entirely feel. He said things I had heard before, our marriage in fragments, our future in rhetorical flourishes, but his voice lacked the weight of real accountability. It had the opacity of someone who had already arranged their life to avoid consequence. When he turned to me, his face an open question, I handed him the ring. He seemed to expect a dramatic confrontation, some speech that would make his sins look novel. Instead, I said what had to be said. "I came home for Thanksgiving," I told him, my voice steady. "I came back to a house that had been used as a convenience. I stayed with a man who deserved better than their absence. I am returning these because they belong to you technically, but not in the sense of what you thought you owned." He fumbled for an answer. "Please," he said, "we can fix this. Let me—" The sentence trailed. I shook my head. "You could have fixed it before you left," I said. I did not say everything I wanted to say. Some parts of me still carried a tenderness for the idea of who he might have been. but there is a rightness to a simple final act. I put his keys in his palm as well and watched him collect the small tokens of a life he had meant to leave intact and did not. The family fell apart in ways that were neither theatrical nor particularly satisfying. Elaine's distance hardened into resentment. She accused Victor of playing games and suggested in a voice I recognized as a mode of defense that he had been manipulated into choosing these actions. Melissa, who had once brought over pies and told me she had seen too much of the world, blistered at Elaine with a plain truth. He was kind to people.
You left. You can be angry, but don't lie about it. The neighbors' ordinary dignity in their testimony was, I think, more devastating than any rhetorical takedown. People saw the small truth of how the family had acted, and that testimony had a way of sticking. Brady tried legal pressure, calls to lawyers he could find, threats of litigation. Patricia met each call with a steady explanation of the evidence and a quiet willingness to litigate if necessary. They will likely challenge, she said to me later, in the privacy of the kitchen when the flood of people had left and the house felt unbearably thin. They have less room to maneuver now that the documents are in order. The bank has records. Witnesses have sworn statements. These things matter. I did not gloat at this. The victory, such as it was, felt somber. Victor's voice had been the true agent of consequence, not my cleverness. I felt the modest pride of someone who had followed a man's wishes and held a space for dignity to be honored. After the initial storm passed, I packed a small bag and drove away. I did not immediately join another life. I drove to the edge of town and sat with the car window down, letting the November air cut through a heat that had gathered around my sternum. The ring, returned, kept its silence. I thought about gratitude for strange kinds of gifts, a man who trusted me enough to ask for help, neighbors who lent simple but decisive aid, a lawyer who spoke tender truths without sentimentality. On the road, I felt a lightness that surprised me, grief tempered by relief, sorrow softened by the knowledge that I had not abandoned someone who asked to be seen. I thought of the house with its rocking chair, now empty in the literal sense, but full in the way living rooms keep the past. I thought of Victor's final instructions that money be used to support elder dignity causes. He had wanted his life to end in utility rather than fury. There are things that do not end neatly. The family might still contest parts of Victor's estate. Lawsuits could be filed. Emotions could be raw for years. I will not promise you a tidy resolution, because life rarely grants those. What I can say is that in those weeks I learned something about the currency of presence. Staying had cost me comfort, but it gave someone else a kindness that seemed, in the end, to be the only kind of justice that mattered. I found a small apartment with a window that faced a clump of maples. I started taking freelance projects again, simple design work that allowed me time not only to earn, but also to build life. I volunteered in a small way with one of the charities Victor had named. It felt an appropriate way to honor the last choices of a man who had loved dignity more than noise. Sometimes, in the quiet evenings, I set a teacup out on the small table and think of the rocking chair. I tell myself the story in a different register now, less about betrayal and more about the strange, stubborn miracle of two people unrelated by obligation who made a last chapter less lonely. There is a bitter sweetness I carry, grief for the absence of a life I had thought my own, and gratitude for the dignity we managed to preserve. I came home for Thanksgiving and found an empty house and a man in a rocking chair. I left with memories, a folder of documents, and a clearer sense of the kind of person I wanted to be, one who shows up, who records truth with care, who tends the small rituals that make a life human.
It is not a triumphant ending. It is a settlement of sorts, a living choice to honor someone who asked to be seen and heard when others chose not to look. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been blindsided by someone's choice or found yourself caring for someone while the people who should have acted did not, leave a comment below. Tell me which moment stayed with you. In the weeks and months that followed, the legal paperwork remained a quiet background process. A few journalists called, sensing the human knot of betrayal and dignity. I declined to be a spectacle. Patricia handled inquiries with the same cool steadiness she had shown at the kitchen table. The charities Victor had chosen received the gifts he intended, and I made a point to visit one and meet people whose lives were better for the support. Their gratitude was granular and human, someone receiving a ride to a clinic, a caregiver being paid for hours already worked. Those were not dramatic victories, but they were the kind that mattered to Victor. Brady and Elaine's lives moved on as well, though differently. They argued, paid lawyers, and carried on with certain social rituals that craft a public life. The bank's audit took its course. I do not relish the idea of their humiliation. I simply note that their choices returned to them in the form of consequences they had tried not to reckon with. Me? I learned slowly to let mornings be ordinary again. I cooked peaches sometimes because Victor liked them and they taste like memory. I answered emails and took on projects that paid the bills and left space for me to breathe. I have a friend now, someone who knows the whole story and does not flinch at my reluctance to speak of it often. He understands the peculiar dignity that comes from staying when others leave. The last thing Victor said to me, in a voice that had grown thin but remained bright in its clarity, was, "Live without small compromises." I think of that every morning. It does not mean life becomes a series of grand moral tests. It means paying attention to who you allow to hold your story, to who you let sign the ledger of your future. It means making choices with other people's dignity in mind. So I left the house that Thanksgiving with a packed bag and a heart heavier than I expected and lighter in other ways I had not predicted.
I left Brady with his things and myself with the knowledge that sometimes returning is the bravest act you can perform. I left with an envelope of papers that proved a man's final requests were not idle words. I drove into sunlight that had the plain generosity of late November and felt for the first time in months that leaving could be an act of renewal. Which scene in this story stayed with you? Share it. And if you want more true-to-life narratives about ordinary people doing hard things, subscribe and share this story with someone who might need to hear it.